Eliza Hale has lived inside a lie. On a remote ranch where silence is mistaken for weakness, she has learned how to disappear in plain sight, how to survive by letting the world underestimate her. The past, she believes, has been buried deep enough to stay quiet. Then the fences begin to fail. A stranger arrives, watchful and controlled, seeing more than he says. The land grows restless. The town starts remembering things it would rather forget, and a truth Eliza has protected with absolute silence begins to surface, slowly, deliberately, and with consequences that cannot be undone. If you enjoy emotionally rich stories like this, make sure to subscribe and leave a like. It helps these stories find the listeners who appreciate them most. Now, back to where we left off. The cattle stopped moving before the sound reached the house. Eliza Hale noticed because she'd been watching them through the kitchen window, hands submerged in dishwater that had gone tepid. The herd had been grazing steadily all afternoon, their movements creating a rhythm she'd learned to read through the subtle shifts in their bodies. Now they stood motionless, heads turned toward the tree line. She pulled her hands from the water and dried them slowly, her eyes never leaving the window. Outside, dusk settled low and heavy, staining the fields copper and bruised purple. The screen door at the back of the house stood open, rocking slightly on its hinge. It hadn't been open when she started washing. Eliza didn't call out. Her father was in the barn. He'd been there since late afternoon, fixing a latch that had refused to stay fixed for years. She slipped on her boots, grabbed a jacket, and stepped into the cooling air. The walk to the barn took longer than usual. The gravel path felt louder beneath her feet. She could feel the vibration of a truck humming in the distance. She felt it before she saw him. A quiet presence. A man stood near the outer fence line, half-shadowed by the last light of day. He was tall, taller than her father, with dark hair that needed cutting, dressed in dark work clothes that blended too well with the land, his posture loose in a way that suggested readiness rather than rest. Eliza stopped. The man turned his head. Their eyes met across the distance. He didn't offer a wave or a greeting. He simply looked at her, his gaze steady, unreadable, as if he'd already accounted for her presence before she arrived. He took one step closer to the fence, then another, stopping well short of it. Close enough now that she could see his face clearly. Late 30s, maybe older. Hard lines around the mouth. Eyes too watchful to belong to someone passing through by accident.
I'm looking for work, he said. She didn't react to the sound of his voice. Instead, she kept her face carefully composed into the expression she'd perfected over 5 years. Blank, gentle, unthreatening. Slowly, she walked to the fence and stopped opposite him, separated by 2 rails of weathered wood. She opened her notebook and wrote carefully, making sure her hand didn't shake. "You're on private land." He glanced at the notebook, then back at her. His gaze flicked briefly to the house, the barn, the tree line beyond. "I know." The word landed flat. Eliza wrote again. "My father is in the barn." "I know," the man replied. "I saw him earlier."
She lifted her eyes. He was watching her more closely now, as if looking at a puzzle he intended to solve. Eliza reached for her notebook and wrote carefully, "Where did you come from?" She held it up for the stranger to read. The man exhaled, slow. "I was passing through," he said. "Saw your gate was cut." He gestured in the direction of the gate. Eliza turned away without answering and walked toward the barn. She didn't rush. She didn't run. The man fell into step behind her, his stride quiet, unhurried, matching her pace without effort. She felt him there the entire way. Her father looked up when they entered, relief flashing briefly across his face before he caught himself. Thomas Hale was a tall man, made taller by the way he held himself. Shoulders back, spine rigid, as if bracing against weight only he could feel.
"Eliza,"
Thomas Hale said loudly, the way he always did.
"You okay?"
She handed him the notebook with a single line written on it. He read it, frowned, then glanced at Rowan. "This about the gate?" Thomas asked.
Rowan nodded. "Someone cut it." Thomas swore under his breath. "Third time this month. Name's Rowan Black." Rowan introduced himself. "Figured you might need help."
Eliza watched Rowan as her father spoke, watched the way his attention shifted, cataloging the space, the tools, the exits, the way his shoulders angled slightly, as if already positioning himself between them and something unseen.
"That your truck?" Thomas asked. Rowan didn't hesitate. "Yes?" Thomas scratched his jaw. "I could use the help. Night watch, maybe. Things have been off." Rowan's gaze slid back to Eliza, not asking permission, assessing consequence. "I'll take it," he said.
Thomas rubbed a thumb along his jaw. "This is my daughter, Eliza. She can't hear and she doesn't speak, but she can read and write." He nodded once, a minimal acknowledgement. Thomas continued, "Eliza, he'll stay tonight. I'm going to let him fix the gate." Eliza felt the weight of the decision settle into the room like a door closing. A stranger had come to the ranch, a dangerous man, unless she missed her guess entirely. Her father had let him stay. Eliza could not sleep that night. She lay on her back, staring at the faint outline of the ceiling fan above her bed, feeling the house breathe around her. Outside her window, Rowan moved. She could not always place him precisely, but she felt the way his presence altered the dark. She thought about the way he'd looked at her, not with pity, like so many others, not with the awkward discomfort of people who didn't know how to interact with someone disabled. He'd looked at her like she was a variable in an equation he was still solving, like he wasn't entirely convinced by her silence. The thought should have frightened her. Instead, it sent something else through her chest. A flutter of… what? Anticipation? Recognition? Morning came too early and too bright. Sunlight poured through the kitchen windows, turning dust motes into drifting sparks. Eliza stood at the counter slicing bread, the rhythm of the knife steady against the board. Her father sat at the table with his coffee, his eyes clearer than they had been in weeks. "He didn't sleep," Thomas said, nodding toward the yard. "I woke around 4. He was still out there." Eliza kept cutting. "He knows what he's doing," her father added after a moment, as if reassuring himself. "Whatever's circling this place will think twice now." Eliza doubted that. There was something too deliberate about his presence, too convenient about his timing. But her father seemed to trust him, at least provisionally. She finished preparing the food. Eggs, bread, leftover beef warmed carefully so it would not dry, and plated it with habit-born precision. When she reached for the third plate, she paused. Rowan was not part of the house, not yet. But the image of him standing beyond the barn, alert and alone, lodged itself where logic did not reach. She wiped her hands and took up her notebook. Outside, Rowan was at the corral repairing the damaged fence. His movements were efficient and exact, as though daylight did not inconvenience him, as though visibility was merely another condition to account for. His sleeves were rolled to his forearms, revealing old scars that offered no invitation for explanation. She approached slowly. Rowan looked up before she reached him. He straightened, wiping his hands on his jeans, his attention narrowing as it always did when she entered his space. There was no softness in his expression, only awareness sharpened to focus. She stopped a few feet away and wrote carefully. "Lunch. Please join us." He read the words once, then again. His gaze shifted toward the house, the windows, the shape of domestic life that clearly did not belong to him.
"You don't owe me," he said. She shook her head once, decisive. Rowan studied her as if measuring whether the invitation was what it appeared to be or something else entirely. Then he nodded. "All right."
He washed at the outdoor spigot, scrubbing his hands with more care than necessary. When he followed her to the house, he neither led nor lagged, matching her pace with watchful precision. Thomas looked up in surprise when Rowan entered the kitchen.
"Well," he said, setting his mug down. "Didn't expect you before sundown." "South fence is done," Rowan replied.
Eliza set the plates down and took her seat, her notebook closed beside her. She watched Rowan sit as if the chair were temporary, his eyes never fully leaving the room. Thomas talked more than usual, relieved, perhaps, to let someone else absorb his worries. He cleared his throat. "I'd like to offer you more work, if you're willing. Day rate, plus room and board. We could use the help and—" He glanced at Eliza. "I'd feel better having someone else here." Rowan answered when spoken to, briefly, without elaboration. He ate as though food were fuel and nothing more. "I can stay, for a while." Thomas extended his hand. "Deal." Eliza watched the exchange with a growing sense that she'd just witnessed something irreversible. That by accepting Rowan Black's help, they'd invited something into their lives that wouldn't leave easily.
When lunch ended, Rowan stood. "I'll finish the east fence." Then he turned to Eliza. "Thank you for the hospitality, Miss Hale."
He was speaking aloud despite supposedly knowing she couldn't hear him, speaking for the benefit of propriety, of maintaining the fiction. But his eyes told a different story. His eyes said, "I see you." She nodded, keeping her expression gentle and empty. But her hands, hidden beneath the table, were shaking. Eliza remained at the table long after the door closed, her notebook open in her hands, her father watching her with quiet curiosity. Who was he?
"Really?"
Not just a drifter looking for work. Men like him didn't drift. They moved with purpose, even when that purpose was hidden. Outside, Rowan returned to the fence line, the ranch wide and exposed around him. He worked with his back to the house, but his attention never fully left it. By the time the sun climbed higher, he had confirmed what he already suspected. The woman on the ranch was not deaf. The days developed a new rhythm. Rowan worked from dawn until dusk, repairing fences, reinforcing gates, clearing brush from the fence line to improve visibility. He was thorough and methodical. Thomas seemed to relax incrementally, the tension in his shoulders easing as the ranch became more fortified. Eliza watched from a careful distance. She brought them lunch in the barn, carried water when the sun proved warmer than expected, helped where she could with tasks that didn't require verbal communication. She learned Rowan's patterns, the way he checked every shadow before entering a building, the way his hand sometimes drifted to his hip, where a weapon might have once rested, the way he positioned himself to keep both her and the horizon in his sightline. On the fourth day, she found him in the barn examining the old bloodstain on the floor. She'd come to feed the horses and stopped short when she saw him crouched beside the dark patch of concrete, one hand hovering over it without quite touching. He must have sensed her presence because his head turned. Their eyes met across the dusty space. Slowly, deliberately, he stood. Eliza felt her pulse quicken. The stain had been there for 5 years. 5 years ago, she'd learned that coincidences could kill you. 5 years ago, she'd watched her father shoot a man who'd come to their ranch in the dark, who'd cornered her in the barn, who'd raised a gun to her head while she stood frozen in terror. She'd been 17. The gunshot had been so close to her ear that the world had gone silent. 5 years she'd been silent. 5 years she'd been safe. Rowan didn't ask about it, didn't point or gesture. He simply looked at her with those gray eyes that seemed to see past every carefully constructed lie she'd built. Then he walked past her, out into the sunlight, and returned to his work. But she knew. He'd marked it, filed it away, added it to whatever mental catalog he was building. That night she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, thinking about the bloodstain and the gun her father kept by his bed, and the way Rowan Black moved through the world like a man who understood violence intimately. Around midnight, she gave up on sleep and went to the kitchen. Her father was in the living room, the television blue light flickering across his cheeks. He slept the way men did when their bodies were exhausted, but their minds refused to surrender completely, one ear always angled toward whatever might go wrong. Eliza had learned to live inside that kind of sleep. It shaped the air of the house. She reached for her notebook out of habit, then let her hand fall away. The pencil lay beside it, sharpened, expectant, as if words alone could hold a boundary. Instead, she eased to the window over the sink and looked out into the yard. Rowan crossed the yard without a flashlight, a darker shape cutting through shadow, as if the land had adjusted itself around him. When he reached the porch, he stopped short of the first step and looked up at the house, not to knock, but to listen. Eliza stood just inside the kitchen, her hand resting on the window frame. She let it creak when she pushed it open. Not much, just enough. Rowan lifted his head immediately. Their eyes met across the narrow space. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then he nodded once, brief and impersonal, and turned away. She watched him walk the perimeter from the porch, watched the way he paused at each fence post, each gate, each place where the land might give way to someone patient enough to wait. He carried no visible weapon. That did not reassure her. Eliza went to her room and shut the door. She leaned her forehead against the wood for a count of 3 before moving away. She changed clothes quietly, pulling on a dress that fit loosely, tying her hair back. She pulled her jacket tighter over it and went down the steps. In the kitchen, she picked up her notebook and pencil, then hesitated, her fingers lingering on the counter before she turned away. The back door opened onto the narrow porch that wrapped around the house. The night air felt cooler now, sharper, carrying the faint metallic scent of cut wire. She stepped down and followed the line of the house, letting the porch light fall behind her. Every instinct argued that she should stay inside, let Rowan earn the pay her father had offered him, let the danger remain someone else's burden. She moved forward anyway, and spotted Rowan at the far gate. He was crouched low, one knee bent, fingers pressed to the ground. When he straightened, his head snapped up, eyes locking onto her position instantly. He did not speak. He did not gesture. He simply waited. Eliza stopped where she was, her silhouette half obscured by the corner of the house. She raised one hand, palm out, the universal sign she'd learned years ago to keep people from shouting at her. Rowan exhaled slowly through his nose. Then he did something unexpected. He turned his back on her. Not fully. Never fully. But enough to show he had clocked her presence and dismissed it. Then he spoke, low and even, the words directed at her as if her hearing were not in question.
"You should be inside." That unsettled her more than any warning would have. She took another step closer. The night shattered. A sharp crack split the air from the tree line, metal snapping under force. Rowan moved at the same instant, covering distance in a blur. He grabbed Eliza by the arm and pulled her back hard, spinning her into the shadow beside the barn, then positioned himself in front of her so that the open pasture disappeared behind his body. His face was close enough that she could see the faint abrasion on his cheekbone, a healed mark, old, but not distant. His breath was steady. His eyes were not. He leaned in close, his mouth near her ear. "Don't move," he said.
The words were quiet, but the meaning carried weight.
It was not a command. It was a fact. She stayed still. She forced her hands to relax at her sides. She made herself breathe through her nose, slow and silent, while every part of her wanted to look around him and search the dark. Rowan eased away just enough to peer past the corner, his body angled, weight balanced on his feet. He released her arm but did not step back. She felt the absence like pressure lifting too fast. He scanned the tree line, eyes sharp, head tilting slightly as if triangulating sound. A footstep came from the brush, faint but unmistakable, and was followed by the stillness of someone who realized they had been heard. Rowan reached behind him and produced a knife so smoothly she almost missed it. The blade caught a sliver of moonlight before disappearing back into shadow. Eliza's stomach tightened. She had seen knives before. Ranch work demanded them. Her father kept them in every drawer and toolbox. This was not a ranch knife. This was too slim, too balanced, made for a purpose that had nothing to do with cutting twine. He glanced down at her then, really looked, not at her face, at her breathing, at the way she'd frozen with panic, at the fact that she had flinched when the sound came, had startled when he touched her.
Rowan's hand came up against the barn wall near her head, palm flat, bracing, while his other hand held the knife low. His shoulders were relaxed in a way that looked wrong, as if he had done this often enough that fear was an inconvenience rather than a warning. Another sound followed, closer now, a shift in the grass, the soft scrape of a boot toe against stone. Eliza felt it in her bones. She wanted to step out, to run back to the house, to wake her father and drag him into a room with locks. But Rowan's presence was a wall. It kept her pinned, not by force, but by the understanding that movement would draw attention. She remained still. Rowan moved. He stepped away from the barn with such control that for an instant it seemed as if he had vanished rather than left. He slipped into the darkness as if it belonged to him, as if he could borrow its shape and wear it. Eliza forced herself to release her breath slowly. She stayed in the shadow, her eyes fixed on the space where he had disappeared. She counted to steady herself, more habit than prayer. 1, 2, 3. Then she heard it, a muffled impact, the sound of a body hitting ground, followed by a short, strangled exhale as if someone had been surprised out of breath. There was a quick scuffle, too contained to be a fight between equals. It ended abruptly. A figure broke away from the tree line and ran. Eliza caught a glimpse of movement, low and fast. Then the dark swallowed it again. Rowan returned minutes later, emerging from the pasture with the same steady pace he had left with, as though nothing had happened. But his knuckles were scraped raw, and a thin line of red ran from beneath his thumb, catching briefly in the dim light before disappearing. He wiped his hand against his thigh and stopped a few feet from her. Eliza watched his hand, watched the calm set of his mouth, and she understood something she had not wanted to understand.
Her heart beat hard enough that she could feel it in her throat. She forced her face to remain calm and reached into her jacket pocket for the notebook. Her fingers were steady, but the pencil scratched too hard against paper. Who was it? Rowan's gaze flicked to the notebook and then back to her. I do not know, he said, but they were not testing the fence. He glanced toward the house, where the porch light still burned as if it could protect anything. She let her eyes soften in the way people expected, the harmless, vacant look that made strangers underestimate her. She wrote another line. "I did not hear anything." She watched him read it. For the first time, his face changed. It was not a smile. It was not anger. It was the smallest tightening around his eyes, as if a final piece had clicked into place. He stepped closer, not crowding her, but close enough that she felt the heat of his body in the cold air. His gaze dropped to her throat, to the pulse visible there, then returned to her eyes. "You reacted before the wire snapped," he said. His voice remained controlled, but there was a sharper edge now. He let his eyes travel over her face now, slow and intent, as though he were reading details she did not know she was giving away. The night wind moved lightly through the grass, and somewhere in the distance a cow let out a low, uneasy sound. Rowan finally spoke again. "You are not to come out here at night," he said. Eliza lifted her eyebrows slightly, the smallest sign of defiance. Rowan stepped back, turning his attention to the open pasture. "Go inside," he said. "Lock the door. You do not stand at the windows."
Eliza hesitated, her mind struggling to place him. He had moved her without asking, had shielded her without knowing her, had returned from the dark with blood on his hands and no need to explain. He had also looked at her as if he could see through the disguise she had worn for years. Then she stepped past him and walked toward the house. She did not run. She did not look behind her. When she reached the back porch, she stopped and looked over the yard. Rowan stood at the edge of the barn shadow, watching the fields with a stillness that promised violence if required. He had begun to understand her, and whatever she was hiding, it was not small. Next morning, the sheriff arrived just after 10. Eliza heard the truck long before it turned onto the drive, the engine laboring slightly as it climbed the shallow rise. She stood at the kitchen counter with a cup of tea she had already forgotten to drink, her gaze fixed on the window as the vehicle came into view. Rowan was outside before the truck fully stopped. He positioned himself where he could see both the drive and the house. To anyone watching, he looked like a man hired to work a ranch. To Eliza, he looked like a line drawn in the dirt. The sheriff climbed out slowly. He was a thick-set man with a sunburned neck and a hat that had molded itself to his head over decades. He paused long enough to take in Rowan, the fences, the land, as if cataloging before stepping forward.
"Mornin'," the sheriff said. Rowan nodded. "Sheriff?" No friendliness, no hostility, recognition without invitation. The sheriff's eyes lingered a moment longer than necessary. "Didn't expect to see new faces out here." "Fence work," Rowan said. "Night watch." The sheriff grunted, non-committal, and turned toward the house. Eliza moved before he knocked. She opened the door and stepped onto the porch, notebook already in hand. Her father appeared behind her, slower, his expression tightening when he saw the badge. "Sheriff," Thomas said, "what can we do for you?" The sheriff tipped his hat slightly. "Had a report come in last night. Somebody spotted movement near the South Road. Thought it might be related to your earlier complaints." Thomas shifted his weight. "We've had trouble with the fence again." "So I hear," the sheriff said. His gaze slid to Eliza. "Something you know, miss?" Eliza watched Rowan from the corner of her eye. He did not look at the sheriff. He looked at the tree line. She shook her head, the practiced motion smooth and convincing. She held up her notebook. "I didn't hear anything." The sheriff read it, then smiled in a way that did not reach his eyes. "Of course you didn't." Rowan turned then. His attention settled fully on the sheriff, and something in the air changed, tightening by degrees. "She was inside," Rowan said, Gate was cut. I handled it.
The sheriff raised his eyebrows. Handled it how? Rowan met his gaze calmly.
Whoever it was ran.
The sheriff studied him, assessing. You get a look at them? No. A pause stretched. The sheriff's eyes moved between Rowan and Eliza, lingering just a moment too long on her notebook, her stillness. Well, he said finally, if you see anything else, you know where to find me. He tipped his hat again and turned back to his truck, but before climbing in, he called back. Might want to stop by my office, fill out some paperwork. It wasn't a request.
I'll do that,
Rowan said. The truck pulled away, leaving silence in its wake.
Inside, the house felt smaller. Thomas busied himself with coffee that did not need refilling. Rowan stepped just inside the doorway, then stopped, as if crossing further would mean something he was not ready to claim. That was about more than the fence, Thomas said. Rowan nodded once. Someone's probing. Eliza opened her notebook. For what? Rowan read the words, then looked at her instead of answering right away. His gaze was steady, thoughtful, not accusing, but not dismissive either. You, he said. The word landed cleanly. Thomas frowned. My daughter? Rowan did not look away from Eliza. Someone thinks she knows something. Eliza felt the familiar tightening in her chest, the instinct to retreat, to fold inward. She did neither. She wrote again. They're wrong. Rowan's mouth curved slightly, not in amusement, but in acknowledgement of the lie for what it was. Maybe, he said, but that won't stop them from checking. Silence filled the room. Thomas looked between them, confusion edging toward fear. Rowan straightened. I'll stay on nights. You keep the doors locked. No wandering. Rowan stepped back onto the porch, reclaiming his place between the house and whatever watched from beyond the trees. Eliza stood just inside the doorway, listening. She understood now that the danger was no longer abstract. It had a direction, and it was closing in. The body was found 2 days later. Eliza knew before anyone came to the house. The ranch carried news ahead of people when it was bad enough. The ravine lay just beyond the property boundary, a narrow cut where runoff gathered after heavy rain. No one went there anymore. The body pulled from it had been there long enough for the details to soften, long enough for certainty to dissolve into rumor. By afternoon, the town had decided what that meant. Someone had survived. Someone had come back. People talked. They talked near the gate in lowered voices at the feed store, in sentences that stopped when Eliza entered a room. They didn't speak to her. They spoke around her, as if silence had emptied her of understanding. A woman down the road locked her doors before sunset. A neighbor pulled his truck into the barn instead of leaving it by the house. Someone's dog barked through the night until it went hoarse. Fear had found a direction. That night, the sound that woke her was different. Not wire, not footsteps. Impact. She sat up in bed, her pulse quickening, listening hard. The night stretched. Then came movement, quick and contained, followed by the unmistakable sound of someone breathing through pain that had not yet decided whether it would deepen. Minutes passed. The back door opened. Eliza was already at the bottom of the stairs when Rowan stepped inside. There was blood on his shirt. Not a dramatic spill. Not a wound meant to alarm. Just enough to darken the fabric along his side, to mark him as someone who had not walked away untouched. He closed the door behind him quietly. Eliza moved to block his path before he could speak. She pointed toward the sink, For the first time since she had known him, he hesitated. It was not fear. It was calculation. The pause of a man deciding whether to accept help or refuse it, because refusal felt safer. Eliza did not lower her hand. Rowan exhaled slowly, then nodded once. He stripped off the bloodied shirt without ceremony and stood bare-chested in the kitchen light, the wound along his ribs already swelling, already bruising. Eliza turned the tap on and gathered a clean cloth, her movements precise, steady. She did not rush. She cleaned the cut carefully, her focus absolute. The blood came away easily, leaving behind angry red skin and a shallow break that would heal, given time. Her fingers brushed his wrist once as she reached for fresh water.
Rowan's jaw tightened, the muscle jumping once before he forced it still. His hand closed around her wrist, not hard, but final. He held it there just long enough to remind himself why he couldn't allow more. "Don't," he said. She looked up at him. She did not pull away. With her free hand, she reached for the notebook on the counter and wrote a single word. "Why?" Rowan released her immediately and stepped back, as if distance were the only way to restore control. His hand fell to his side, fingers flexing once, then stilling. "Because I don't stop halfway," he said. The words were not a warning, they were a truth offered without embellishment. He paused, his gaze still on her, steady and intent. "I know you hear," he continued, his voice even, stripped of accusation. "You always have." Eliza did not move. She did not lower the notebook or look away. "Who are you hiding from?" he asked softly. Eliza closed the notebook. She could have spoken then. The words were ready. She let them go unused. Some truths were still too dangerous to share, even for him, especially for him. Rowan watched her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "All right, you don't have to tell me. Not yet."
Silence settled between them, thicker than before. No longer a shield, but a line neither of them crossed. Eliza finished tending the wound, her hands steady, her expression unreadable. When she was done, she stepped back. Outside, the ranch lay quiet, the ravine holding its secrets, the past pressing closer with every hour. Rowan picked up his shirt and left the house without another word. Eliza stood alone in the kitchen, the scent of iron still sharp in the air, listening to his steps fade back into the night. For the first time, her silence was no longer mistaken. It was recognized, and that made it far more dangerous than before. The sheriff came back the next day, and this time he did not pretend it was a courtesy. Eliza watched from the kitchen window as the sheriff climbed out of his truck. Behind him, one of the deputies lingered by as if the land itself had earned caution. Rowan was at the far end of the yard. He did not look up right away. He waited. The sheriff looked at the house as though it were a story he had never trusted, and now intended to reread.
"Morning, Hale,"
he called. Thomas stepped onto the porch, wiping his hands on a rag. "Sheriff?" The sheriff nodded toward Rowan.
"He's still here?"
Rowan did not approach. He let the sheriff speak first. Thomas's expression hardened.
"He's working."
The sheriff's gaze narrowed.
"Name?"
"Rowan Black," Rowan said from where he stood. The sheriff adjusted his stance, as if the name carried weight he did not care to admit. He walked closer, stopping just short of the porch light, a habit of positioning that spoke of long practice with men he did not trust.
"Mr. Black,"
the sheriff repeated.
"How long you planning to stay here?"
Rowan's expression did not change.
"As long as I'm needed."
A faint smile pulled at the sheriff's mouth. It was not friendly.
"That's so."
Rowan lifted one shoulder in a minimal shrug.
"You need me gone? Say it."
The sheriff glanced toward Thomas.
This is your call, Hale. But I'll say this. A stranger shows up right when bodies start surfacing and fences get cut. It makes me curious.
Rowan's eyes remained steady.
Bodies don't surface on schedule. Neither do predators.
The word landed with quiet certainty. The sheriff stared at him for a moment, then turned his attention to Eliza, who stood just inside the doorway with her notebook in hand. The sheriff's gaze lingered.
You keep her inside, Hale, he said to Thomas. Folks in town are talking. They're nervous. They remember old things.
Thomas stiffened.
We're not looking for trouble.
The sheriff nodded as if he had heard that line too many times.
Trouble doesn't wait for invitations.
He tipped his hat and returned to his truck. The deputy followed, casting one last look toward Rowan before climbing in. When they were gone, the yard felt exposed. Thomas stood on the porch a moment longer, his shoulders tense beneath the thin fabric of his shirt.
He's not wrong to be suspicious.
Eliza watched her father's face change, the uncertainty that flickered there, the resentment that followed it. Rowan turned sharply.
He's looking for someone to blame.
Thomas scoffed.
He thinks you're the danger,
Rowan said, without moving closer.
Yes, he said. The easiest target is the man no one knows.
Rowan went back to the corral, as if the conversation had reached the only conclusion it could.
That evening, Eliza carried a basket of folded towels to the barn because it gave her a reason to move, and because she could not stand the house tightening around her father's fear. The barn smelled of hay and oil and old wood warmed by the day. Dust floated in the slanted light like ash. She heard voices before she reached the door. Thomas and Rowan, speaking low. She stopped just outside, close enough that the boards pressed cool against her palm. She listened.
They're not looking for money, Rowan said. Thomas gave a short, humorless laugh.
They're looking for something else.
A pause followed, the kind that made her heart slow down and thud heavier in her chest. Eliza? Rowan asked carefully. Eliza pressed her palm flat against the barn wall. Thomas's footsteps shifted inside the barn.
She was young, he said, and the words were sharp, defensive. She doesn't know what she knows.
Rowan's voice remained level. Then someone thinks she does. Thomas studied him for a long moment.
If Sheriff finds out you hunting Marino family...
Eliza pulled her hand away from the wall and stepped back, the towel basket suddenly heavy. She did not go inside. She walked back to the house the long way, keeping to the outer edge of the yard, watching the tree line, listening to the ranch breathe and hold. The storm rolled in after midnight. It came out of nowhere. One moment the air close and still, the next split by wind that rattled the windows and drove rain against the siding in hard sheets. Thunder broke overhead, low and prolonged, making the house tremble on its foundation. The lights flickered once, then went out. Thomas muttered from the living room, half awake. Damn it. Eliza moved to the drawer where they kept the candles, her fingers finding the familiar shapes. She lit one with a match and carried it to the table, the flame throwing weak light over the kitchen walls. Rowan came in through the back door without knocking, soaked through, rainwater trailing off his hair and shoulders. He shut the door behind him, his gaze sweeping the room in the same quick assessment he always made. The candlelight caught the planes of his face, making him appear even harder, as if the dark belonged to him more than daylight ever could.
Thomas rubbed his eyes. "Sit," he said, voice rough. "No point pacing in this." Rowan did not sit right away. He remained standing for a moment, listening to the storm the way he listened to everything else. Then he pulled out the chair across from Eliza and sat with controlled economy, forearms resting loosely on the table, hands still. The candle flickered between them, the flame bending whenever thunder rolled close. Eliza took her notebook and wrote slowly, making each letter deliberate. "Are you dangerous?" She slid the notebook across the table. Thomas looked between them, the space between his daughter's silence and Rowan's calm beginning to strain him. Rowan read it and answered without hesitation. "Yes." No explanation, no apology.
The storm that had battered the house earlier had quieted. The night lay thin and watchful, stripped down to sound and breath. It came back to her in fragments, the way it always did. Sound before image. A voice pleading, breaking, too loud for the quiet of the land. A gun clattering to the ground, metal striking rock in sharp, panicked beats. Her father's breath, uneven and close, shaking in a way she had never heard before and had never been able to forget. She had heard everything. She had understood enough. Silence had kept questions from finding their way into the house. Silence had kept the story unfinished, blurred, survivable. Silence had kept her father free. Now, silence kept her alive. Eliza woke in the middle of the night, sweat cooling against her skin, her breath shallow, her hands clenched in the sheets. For a moment she did not move. She listened instead, orienting herself by sound, by absence. The dream clung longer than usual. It surfaced the way certain memories always had in her life. Sideways, incomplete, carried on someone else's voice rather than her own. She lay still until the image loosened its hold. Then she swung her legs over the side of the bed and stood, moving carefully, as if sudden motion might pull the past fully into the present. The house was quiet. Her father slept downstairs. Beyond the walls, the ranch breathed, the fences holding, the dark pressed close. She dressed without turning on the light. She did not reach for the notebook. The decision settled in her body before it reached her thoughts. Eliza eased down the stairs, each step placed with care, the old wood barely whispering under her feet. She paused at the back door, listening, then slipped outside into the night. The air was cool and damp, carrying the scent of earth and wet grass. Clouds dragged low across the sky, thinning enough to let a pale wash of moonlight touch the pasture. She kept to shadow, following the line of the house, then the barn. The path she had walked 100 times without thinking. The sound came from behind her this time, close enough that she felt it rather than heard it. A hand closed over her mouth. Hard. The other arm wrapped around her ribs, crushing the breath from her chest before she could react. She was pulled backward into shadow, her heels skidding across damp ground, her back striking something solid. Wood. Fence post. She didn't know. The grip tightened instantly. Efficient. Practiced. Her pulse slammed. The man leaned in close, his breath hot against her ear, sour with sweat and something metallic. His forearm locked across her chest, pinning her arms to her sides.
"Quiet," he breathed.
The word was unnecessary. The hand over her mouth made sure of that. She went still. Not because she was weak, because stillness bought time.
"Impossible. He's dead. Father threw his body in the river 5 years ago." But the voice was unmistakable. Raspy, damaged, from the gunshots, from nearly drowning, from surviving what should have killed him. But his. Marco Angelo. Alive.
Her fingers curled once, slowly, against her palm. She listened instead, to his breathing, uneven and eager, to the faint sound of fabric shifting as he adjusted his grip, to the ground beneath her feet, the way it sloped slightly toward the river where her father had thrown his body. the river that should have taken him away forever.
You remember.
He murmured, the words pressed too close to her skin.
I know you do.
Her stomach tightened. She remembered. God, she remembered everything.
6 years ago, she'd been running an errand in town, ducked into the back room of a hardware store looking for her father, and stopped short when voices carried through the storage room door. Marco Angelo's voice, low, confident. Others with him, men who spoke like nothing they said could ever reach the wrong ears. The Marino family. She hadn't understood the details then, only the tone, the certainty, the sense that what was being planned was wrong, dangerous, the kind of conversation no one was meant to overhear. She'd left quietly, said nothing, thought nothing of it. A year later, he'd shown up at their ranch and looked up to see her in the barn. Recognition had flashed across his face in that terrible moment before he'd pulled his gun. He'd remembered her, the girl from the hardware store, the girl who had heard too much. He'd come to silence her. Her father's bullet should have ended it, should have killed him. But somehow Marco had survived, crawled from the river, passed between safe hands, hidden until the damage could be mended. And she'd spent those 5 years pretending to be deaf and mute. Because Marco Angelo's gang didn't forgive witnesses, didn't leave loose ends. Now he was here again, standing behind her, holding her hostage. Every choice she'd made for 5 years, the silence, the deception, the fear, it had all been for this moment she'd prayed would never come. He loosened his hold just enough to shift her weight, keeping her pinned but moving her backward, inch by inch. His hand never left her mouth.
Don't make this hard.
He said softly.
You don't even have to say anything.
The realization cut through her panic like a knife. He still believed the lie. Still believed she couldn't hear him, that she couldn't answer, that she was exactly what she appeared to be. Helpless. The night held its breath. Then the pressure vanished. Violence arrived like a rupture. The man was wrenched backward with brutal force, his grip breaking as Rowan came out of the dark like something unleashed. Eliza staggered forward, catching herself against the fence as the 2 men collided behind her. She heard bone strike bone, heard air forced violently from lungs. Rowan moved with terrifying precision, his body all angles and momentum, driving the man away from her without hesitation. A fist connected, a knee followed. The struggle was short and vicious, contained to the space where shadow swallowed detail. The man tried to run. He didn't get far. Rowan brought him down hard, forcing him to the ground with a sharp, efficient motion that ended resistance instantly. The man groaned once, then went still. Rowan stood over him for a moment longer than necessary. Then he turned. Eliza was shaking now, the delayed reaction crashing through her all at once. Rowan was in front of her in seconds, his hands on her shoulders, gripping hard enough to feel through fabric.
His eyes searched her face, her throat, her arms, taking inventory. "Did he hurt you?" he demanded. She shook her head. Rowan's jaw clenched. He pulled her closer without warning, one arm wrapping around her shoulders, turning her so her back was to his chest, placing himself between her and the dark again. He stayed like that for a moment, his breath uneven now, the restraint he carried fraying at the edges. "You shouldn't have been out here," he said, lower now. She did not argue. She did not write. She leaned back against him just enough to feel his presence, solid and unyielding. Behind them, the man on the ground groaned again. Rowan's hold tightened fractionally. "This ends here," he said. Not to her, but to the night itself.
Rowan recognized him. Has for years.
If he's involved.
He guided her toward the house without asking, one hand firm at her back, his body angled protectively, never once letting the dark out of his sight. Rowan made the call before dawn. Eliza heard his voice from the house, low and precise, carried through the open space of the barn and across the stillness of the ranch. He did not raise it. He did not explain more than necessary. He gave a location, a condition, and a warning that sounded less like advice than fact. When the sheriff arrived, he brought no deputies this time. He brought handcuffs. The man was dragged out of the tree line near the ravine, limping, bloodied, and furious. Rage with nowhere left to go. Rowan stood a few paces back while the sheriff secured him, his posture loose, his attention already shifting away, as if the threat had ended the moment it was contained.
"You could have killed him," the sheriff said, more observation than accusation. Rowan shrugged once. "Didn't need to." The sheriff studied him, then turned his attention to the man in cuffs. "You," he said quietly. "I should have known." Eliza watched from the porch, her notebook held loosely in her hands. She saw the shift in the sheriff's stance, the way his certainty recalibrated. "Get him in the truck," the sheriff muttered, more to himself than anyone else. Then he looked up at Eliza. "You're coming with me later," he said. Thomas stepped forward. "For what?" The sheriff's gaze never left Eliza. "Because your daughter is the only surviving witness." Eliza's chest tightened. "She saw something," he continued. "Enough that he disappeared instead of finishing what he started." Thomas's face drained of color. "She can't." "She can," the sheriff cut in. "And she will. Court's in a few weeks." He secured the door of the truck and climbed in without another word. The ranch went quiet again.
The courthouse smelled of old paper and floor polish, the kind of place where sound traveled even when people tried to keep it contained. Eliza felt it immediately, the way footsteps echoed too long, the way murmurs lingered in the corners of the room after they were meant to fade. She sat at the narrow table beside the clerk, her notebook open in front of her, a pen resting between her fingers. The dress she wore was simple, chosen not to draw attention. It did not matter. Attention found her anyway. The sheriff sat a few rows back, arms crossed, watching the room with the air of a man who had waited years for this moment. Her father sat behind him, rigid, his hands locked together so tightly his knuckles had gone white. Across the room, Marco sat beside his attorney, cleaned up, bandaged, his fury banked but not extinguished. His eyes never left Eliza. Neither did someone else's. He was not watching her hands. He was watching her reactions. When a bench creaked behind her, her eyes flicked there an instant before the sound finished registering. When someone coughed to her left, her gaze shifted without conscious thought, precise and immediate. She was listening. The clerk spoke to her gently, too gently, explaining the process as if she were fragile glass. Eliza nodded, lifted her notebook, and began to write. She wrote carefully, deliberately. She described the night years ago without color or speculation. She wrote about the voice, the argument, the gun falling. She did not write about fear. She did not write about her father's breath in her ear, or the way silence had closed around her afterward like a door locking from the inside. The pen scratched softly across paper. She was aware of the room in layers, the shuffle of feet, the faint rattle of the radiator, the intake of breath when her words were read aloud by the clerk. She did not look at the man at the defense table. She did look at the observer in the back. His eyes narrowed slightly, not with doubt, but with confirmation. At one point, the judge leaned forward. "Miss Hale," he said slowly, Is there anything else you remember? The room went still. Eliza lowered her gaze to the notebook. She could hear the accused shift in his seat, the scrape of restraint against wood. She could hear her father's breathing hitch. She wrote one final sentence. Court adjourned shortly after. The room emptied in careful stages. Chairs scraped back. Papers were gathered. Voices returned, tentative at first, then louder as the weight of testimony lifted from the air. Eliza remained seated until the clerk touched her arm gently and nodded toward the door. Outside, the light felt too sharp. Her father walked beside her in silence, his shoulders drawn tight, his jaw working as if he were chewing through words he could not bring himself to say. The sheriff followed a few paces behind them, speaking briefly to an assistant before breaking off and heading in the opposite direction. Eliza did not look back. She did not need to. She felt the gaze again before they reached the truck. Across the street, near the corner of the courthouse steps, a man stood apart from the small cluster of onlookers. He was dressed plainly, hands in his pockets, posture relaxed in a way that suggested patience rather than ease. His gaze shifted only once, following her as she turned toward the truck. Marco's brother did not follow. The drive back to the ranch passed without conversation. The road stretched long and pale beneath the afternoon sky, the fields rolling out on either side as if nothing had been disturbed, as if the past had not just been dragged into open air and named. When the ranch came into view, Eliza felt the familiar tightening ease just slightly. The house stood as it always had, weathered but solid. The barn, dark, against the horizon, the fences holding. Rowan was already there. He leaned against the side of the barn, arms crossed, watching the road as they approached. He straightened when the truck slowed, his attention sharpening the moment Eliza stepped out. He did not ask how it went. He did not need to. They stood a few feet apart while Thomas went inside, his footsteps heavy on the porch, the screen door closing behind him with a brittle snap.
Rowan's gaze moved over Eliza's face, her posture, the way she held herself. He took in what the courtroom had left behind without touching it. "They pushed," he said. She nodded. He exhaled slowly through his nose. "They always do."
For a moment, neither of them spoke. The ranch settled around them, the late afternoon quiet stretching long and thin. 2 weeks later, the three of them sat at the dinner table, the house warmed by routine again. Plates were passed, food was eaten. The quiet was no longer strained, just spare. Eliza noticed the way Rowan watched her when he thought she wasn't looking, the way his eyes followed her movements, the way he positioned himself to always be between her and potential danger, even when there was no danger left. She noticed these things, and she felt her own awareness of him growing, the way his hands moved with such competence and care, the way her heart beat faster when he was near. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. Rowan set his fork down.
"I'm leaving," he said finally.
Thomas looked up, surprise flickering briefly before something more resigned took its place. Eliza's hand tightened around the notebook at her side. She looked at him then, really looked, the way she had learned to do in silence, taking measure without asking for reassurance. Rowan met her gaze across the table. There was no apology in his expression, no explanation beyond the truth of it. Rowan picked up his fork again and finished his meal, as if nothing essential had changed. But the decision was already there, and it wasn't going to move. Outside at the edge of the property, far enough not to be noticed unless someone was listening for it, a car sat idle on the road. Colt Angelo remained inside it, one hand resting on the steering wheel, his eyes fixed on the house in front of him. Marco had rushed things. Colt never did. Colt did not move. He had time. The bag by the door was small. Rowan hadn't packed much. He never did. The duffel rested where he'd set it earlier, out of the way but not hidden, as if its presence were meant to be noticed without comment. Eliza saw it before dinner ended. She said nothing. Thomas talked instead. About the weather shifting early this year. About how the sheriff had called again, just to say things looked settled. He filled the space with ordinary words, his voice a little too loud, his laughter arriving half a second too late. Rowan remained standing when the plates were cleared. He didn't sit, didn't lean. He stayed near the doorway, one hand braced against the frame, his attention already angled elsewhere. When he stepped outside, Eliza followed. The porch light hummed faintly, insects circling it in restless patterns. The night was clear, deceptively calm, the kind that invited trust if a person wanted it badly enough. Rowan stopped at the edge of the steps. She hadn't meant to block his path, but she did. He halted because she was there, not because he had planned to stop. For a moment, he just looked at her. Not the careful, assessing look he used when counting exits or measuring threats. This was slower, sharper, as if he were registering something he had been deliberately ignoring.
"You don't want what comes with me," he said quietly. The words weren't an explanation. They were a boundary spoken too late. She didn't answer. The silence held between them, dense and unyielding, full of things neither of them allowed themselves to name. Rowan stepped back. The decision didn't waver. He turned, crossed the yard, climbed into his truck. The engine started. Headlights cut across the fence line and swept once over the barn. Then he was gone.
And Eliza stood on the porch long after the sound was gone, understanding exactly what he had taken with him and what he had left behind. Less than an hour later, the house changed. The sound that woke her was not a door or a voice. It was absence. The kind that settled when something had entered quietly and claimed the space as its own. She opened her eyes to the sight of Colt Angelo standing in the doorway. He held a gun loosely at his side, as if it were an extension of his hand rather than a threat. His expression was calm, almost curious. His posture relaxed in a way that suggested time was not a concern. Before she could move, he crossed the room and caught her wrists. He tied her to the chair carefully, methodically. The rope bit just enough to be felt, not enough to draw blood. He stepped back when he was done, assessing his work with mild satisfaction.
Her father's voice came from the hallway. "Eliza?"
Her chest tightened. She shook her head once, hard, the movement sharp enough to hurt. She twisted against the rope, just enough to make the chair scrape softly against the floor. Colt glanced toward the hallway. Too late. Thomas stepped into the room, confusion giving way to recognition in the span of a heartbeat. The gun lifted. The sound was sharp and contained. One shot. No warning. Thomas fell where he stood, his body hitting the floor at an angle that was wrong, his arm folding beneath him as if he'd reached for something that wasn't there. The room went very still. Eliza stared at him. The world narrowed to that one impossible shape on the floor. Tears slipped free without permission, tracking silently down her cheeks.
The word came out before she knew she was speaking. "Dad." It was not loud. It was not panicked. It was unmistakable. Colt turned slowly. His expression shifted, interest replacing indifference.
There it is,
He said quietly.
I wondered how long it would take.
He stepped closer, the gun rising as he spoke. He talked because he enjoyed it, because control meant more when it was explained. He knew she had heard everything years ago, knew she had stayed silent to protect her father, called it loyalty, called it love, called it weakness.
Marco always talked too much.
He continued.
Couldn't help himself. 5 years hiding, and he still couldn't stop bragging. Couldn't stop circling, couldn't stop letting people see him.
He glanced toward the window, the land beyond it.
He made noise.
Colt said.
That's how you get noticed.
The gun steadied, aimed at her chest. Movement flickered in the doorway. Rowan. He hadn't planned to be there. He had been miles down the road when he saw the headlights. Wrong speed, wrong timing, turning onto a road that should have been empty. He slowed, instinct tightening, memory surfacing before thought could stop it. The man stepping out of the car had moved the same way. Too controlled, too calm. Rowan remembered him exactly as he had been years ago, sitting on a concrete floor beside a girl who wasn't breathing anymore. Colt's voice even, almost bored, as he explained why she had to die. A liability, he'd said. Nothing personal. No remorse. No regret. Rowan had turned the truck around before the memory finished unfolding. He had called it in without slowing down. He had reached the house already knowing he was too late to stop something, but not knowing what. Now he stood in the doorway, shadowed, body coiled, attention narrowed to a single point. His gaze flicked once, to her wrists, the rope, the chair, then to the gun. Fear hit him then, sharp and immediate. Not for himself, for her.
She spoke again, deliberately this time, shaping the words carefully. "What do you want from me?" she asked. Colt's head turned toward her voice. His smile widened.
You already gave it to me,
He said.
You flushed Marco out, made him desperate, made him visible.
He tilted his head.
I've been cleaning up his messes since the beginning. This one just took longer.
The conversation bought more time for Rowan to position himself. Colt kept talking.
He never could finish the job,
He said.
so I did.
Rowan lunged. The world collapsed into motion.
He hit Colt hard, driving him sideways as the gun went off. The sound exploded in the room, disorienting, final. For an instant, no one knew where the bullet had gone. They crashed to the floor, bodies tangled. Colt fought savagely, clawing for the weapon. Rowan forced his weight down, one hand locking Colt's wrist, pain flaring white-hot through his side as something tore and burned. Colt wrenched free, gun snapping up again, his attention fixed on Rowan. Another shot rang out. For a moment, no one moved. Eliza's eyes never left Rowan's. Rowan's breath sounded too loud in the ruined quiet. He kneeled on the floor, breath heavy, one hand pressed to his side. He turned his head slowly and looked at Eliza. The door burst open. Voices flooded the room. The sheriff's weapon was still raised as Colt lay motionless on the floor. Dead. The gun across the floor against the leg of the chair. The sheriff stepped closer, speaking again, directing men, securing the scene. Someone cut the rope at her wrists. Hands guided her up, away from the chair, away from the body on the floor. Rowan did not move until she was standing. Only then did he let himself shift, bracing one hand against the wall as he rose. Later, after statements, after the house filled and emptied again, after her father was taken away, they stood outside beneath the same porch light that had hummed earlier that evening. The ranch lay quiet, altered but intact. Rowan leaned against the railing, his injury bandaged, his posture careful but unbowed. Eliza stood a few feet away, the night air cool against her skin.
He studied her for a long moment. Are there any more secrets I should know about? He said finally. The question was quiet, not accusatory, almost wry. Eliza met his gaze. No, she said. Just that. Rowan exhaled once, a short breath that might have been a laugh in another life. His mouth curved faintly, not into a smile, but into something close enough to recognition. "All right," he said. The porch light flickered softly above them, and for the first time since he had arrived at the ranch, Rowan did not feel like leaving was inevitable. Not yet.
And that's where our story ends. If you stayed until the end, let me ask you something. If you were in her place, would you have trusted the silence that kept you alive? Or would you have spoken, knowing that once the truth is heard, it can never be taken back? Tell me what you think in the comments. If this story stayed with you, if it made you listen a little closer, consider liking, subscribing, and sharing it with someone who understands how dangerous restraint can be when power, memory, and truth collide. Until next time, the lights are still on.